Scott, I'm going to kick it off with you and with the positional assessment, since this was kind of your baby, and then obviously I want to get some of Connor's thoughts here. Kind of a lot to digest, and obviously this is going to segue into our next topic as well, but we'll get to that momentarily. We've got Dre Kirkpatrick entering free agency after a pretty sound season with the team in his second full year as a starter. You've had two guys sign an offseason contract at the safety positions, and after slow starts by George Aloka and Sean Williams, they ended up picking things up at the end of the year and actually coming up with some pretty decent seasons. Obviously, some decisions to make here. What's your overall, I guess, grade of the unit, both corners and defensive backs, and maybe talk about the priority of re-signing Dre Kirkpatrick amongst other guys that are going to be hitting free agency in other spots for the team?
It is so hard to give them a grade because they just had seeing both the defensive back coordinators leave with Mark Carrier and Vance Joseph, and obviously now Vance Joseph is head coach for the Broncos. They seem to start slowly, but they really seem to pick it up later in the year. And I know part of that too comes from pass rush. Obviously, the better pass rush you have, the easier it is for the defensive backs. And the pass rush, for whatever reason, just didn't seem to be there this year. So if I was to give them a grade, I'd just say, I'd say B-. They definitely weren't the unit they were the year before. They definitely lacked the interceptions. Reggie Nelson seemed to have a ton of them, 7 or 8 last year, that they didn't seem to be able to replace. But overall, one of the interesting things is going into this season, most people probably would have said that the cornerbacks was the strong position because you had Dre Kirkpatrick, Adam Jones, you just drafted William Jackson, you still had Darqueze Dennard, who was finally going to get his chance. At least that was, in theory. You had Josh Shaw, come in his second year. You had some depth behind them. And then at safety, after they lost Reggie Nelson, all you had was George Aloka and Sean Williams, who they just re-signed, who really hadn't started much. But by the end of the year, it seemed that the safeties were the stronger unit because you had George Aloka, who had another solid year. Sean Williams, who I thought started really slowly. Probably after the first half of the year, I was ready to dump him and just say, let's get someone else back there. But I think he seemed to turn it on, especially in pass coverage. He just seemed like a major liability to begin the year. He seemed to get much better at that. I think he led all defensive backs in tackles and tied with 3 interceptions with Kirkpatrick and Aloka. So I think he got better. The one thing that kind of worries me going into next year is definitely the cornerback position, which it really shouldn't because you consider that's all they do is draft cornerbacks.
Yep.
But Dre Kirkpatrick, you mentioned him being a free agent, and I'll let you guys talk a little more about that. If we should re-sign him or not, I think obviously, given how shallow the position could be, it seems to be a priority, especially depending what they decide to do with Adam Jones. But worst case scenario is they could be entering next year without Dre Kirkpatrick and without Adam Jones, which just leaves you, as far as experienced cornerbacks, Darqueze Dennard, who can't seem to crack the starting roster, Josh Shaw, and then outside of that, the next 4 guys have a combined 0 tackles. Kaveri Russell, William Jackson III, Shaiki Brown, and Tony McRae. If you look at the official roster per Bengals.com, the guys who are on there, you have 4 guys with no tackles last year, and then Dennard, who doesn't seem to be progressing the way you would have hoped a first-round draft pick would, and then Josh Shaw, who I've been a fan of Josh Shaw. I think he's done a decent job. I don't know if he's starter material, but yeah, I think a lot of that just points to the need to go after someone like Kirkpatrick. And then you look at the safety position, which going in probably looked like the weaker, shallower position beginning 2016. Sean Williams and Georgia Aloka, obviously they're starting. They're both in their mid-20s. They are locked up for a few more years. You kind of feel, okay, we're probably pretty good as far as our starters go. And then you have Deron Smith and Clayton, the kid from Illinois they drafted last year. Both of them got playing time, special teams and on defense. And so as silly as it sounds to say, since they just used a first-round pick on a defensive back, depending on what happens with Kirkpatrick and Jones, wouldn't it be horribly surprising? It'd be very frustrating, but it wouldn't be horribly surprising to see them early in this draft take yet another cornerback.
Yeah. And, you mentioned Russell, and kind of a funny stat. He had more interceptions and tackles, which is one, and it was in that final game there, which was good to see. In the wake of injuries, and he was a former third round pick himself, that was released. So I mean, obviously some teams thought pretty highly of him. Connor, I know you've got a lot of thoughts on Drake Kirkpatrick. You've been really supportive of him, and I would say rightfully so this year. I mean, he really stepped his game up. You saw Adam Jones, just strictly right now talking on the field. You saw a little dip in play there, both at cornerback and as a return man. There was a little bit of a dip there. You saw some ups and downs and ebbs and flows from guys this year, but all in all, I mentioned the improvement of the safeties. You saw Drake Kirkpatrick kind of step his game up, especially towards the middle end of the season. Russell had that one brief kind of nice moment against Baltimore in the finale there.
One pick on one snap.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's 100% right there. I mean, that's awesome. And then you've got William Jackson III coming back. Even number one, I guess I want to ask you, are you encouraged by that group without Kirkpatrick and maybe Jones, as Scott mentioned? And number two, if you're not, how big of a priority then is Drake Kirkpatrick to get back for this defense?
I mean, I think either way, even if Jones was gone, Kirkpatrick should have been. I mean, just you look at the Bengals' mentality in free agency, and they're always an outside-in type of team. I think Jeff Hobson kind of talked about that earlier this week in one of the columns he wrote, and that Kirkpatrick might actually be a bigger free agent, need for the Bengals than Zeitler. Even though Zeitler, most people would argue, has been the better player, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But you look I mean, Whitworth is a guy that is probably a lot easier to get a deal done with just because of his age. Zeitler's a guy hitting the peak of his career, and he was a first-round pick, and he's played really well. So he's going to get a big contract, whether with the Bengals or elsewhere. But with the secondary, you have, even if he's back and none of this offseason stuff happens, you have Adam Jones, who is up there in age, second oldest corner in the NFL, I believe, behind Terrence Newman. And then, like you guys said, it's pretty untested behind him. And so I think, I mean, and to Scott's point, I agree with some, but I think I disagree with a lot in the sense that I think that the safeties going into the year, I thought were the better position group than the corners. Obviously, Sean Williams was kind of untested, and that was definitely a major issue. But I mean, you look at the interception numbers from last year and the year before, and 2 years ago with Reggie Nelson's 8 picks, they had 21. And Scott mentioned they didn't really have anyone who had a ton of interceptions this year, but they, after being third in the league with 21 picks, this year they were fourth in the league with 17, losing Reggie Nelson. And I think, as we saw with the Raiders, he wasn't really the player this year that he was last year. I think most Bengals fans probably anticipated that. Sean Williams really stepped up. I think he was the better player than Reggie Nelson this year. And ultimately, the move they made was a move for the future, not just for this season alone. So I think that was a really encouraging sign. But back to the corners, which is kind of what we've been talking about. I think Dre's just a guy that you have to get done, regardless of how you feel about him. It's just, it's a mentality of locking up your best guys, and I hope Zeitler stays too. I think it's definitely possible and should happen that he should stay, but I don't know. I think it's way easier to justify spending money on a cornerback than it is on a guard, just because, especially even the way the Bengals have operated, it's something that would make sense. And they have, at the worst, they have Christian Westerman or Whitworth can kick inside, or they can find something. They have bodies, but at corner you really don't have much depth or experience. And there's guys, we've seen bright spots from Shaw. We saw Kivari Russell 1 pick on 1 snap. I don't think it's going to happen for the rest of his career, but
probably not.
It's just, yeah. I mean, it's a high standard to meet, but I think that you guys kind of hit the nail on the head in that it's not really a battle tested position, and it's definitely going to be a big need if Drake Kirkpatrick ends up courting another team, because he's a playmaker. And I think the argument against Kirkpatrick, if you're saying if you're an anti-Dre guy, which there's still a lot of people around Cincy Jungle and other Bengals sites, I think the only thing that people really use to quantify against Dre is his penalties, perceived inconsistency, and Pro Football Focus's grades on him. But the positives being he's one of the best press corners in the NFL. who is not targeted very much at all after last year being one of the most targeted corners in the entire league. And Pro Football Focus doesn't grade the snaps that the guy doesn't get targeted, and so you look at a game and Drake Kirkpatrick gets targeted 3 times when covering an Antonio Brown or DeAndre Hopkins, whoever it may be, and he doesn't always play the best receiver in the world, but there have been several games this year where I counted he was targeted like about 3 to 5 times or less, and when you look at a Pro Football Focus grade, it only counts those 5 snaps towards his rating, even though he's made so many. He's covered his guy the entire game and plays 60 snaps, whatever it is. I don't know how many snaps he will play. And so I think ultimately what it comes down to is just with Adam Jones. I think Adam Jones's whole off the field stuff really made it more apparent that the Bengals need to re-sign Drake Kirkpatrick, because it just his on the field play, it wasn't really drastically declining. It really wasn't much of a difference from the year before, even though he was a Pro Bowler the year before. It was kind of reflective of, okay, he's another year older, and the Bengals didn't lock up guarantee a ton of money towards him, so he's an expendable player, like him or not. For the record, I don't really have an opinion on what the Bengals should do with Adam Jones, but I think regardless of that, you have to sign Drake Kirkpatrick. I mean, you drafted him high. It took him a while, but he's where you wanted him to be at the end of his first contract, and that's really what it stems down to. Is that he's where you want him to be at. So why not re-sign him?
Yeah, and I see here's the thing that I see, and that I'm potentially excited about. One of the things, unfortunately, he wasn't as great with it last year as he was this year, and I'm talking about Kirkpatrick, was the big plays, the returns for touchdowns, and he didn't have any interceptions in his first year as a full-time starter. He had, I think, what did we say, 3 this year.
He's had 3 every year except the last year, I think.
Right. And you remember when he was kind of a part-time / fill-in guy in 2014, I think he had 2 return that year. I mean, he's had a handful of returns for touchdowns in his career. This year, the Bengals defense, whether it was the secondary or the defensive line, linebackers, nobody had a return for a touchdown. Now, granted, those are plays that are rare in the NFL. You don't always get those. But when you want to have a dominant defense, you have to have guys that can make those plays, whether it's a scoop fumble all the way, whether it's an interception return for a touchdown. Those things change games. And when the team loses by, I think it was 7 games or 6 games by 8 points or less, those are things that really could change an entire season, those types of plays. So, number one, I think Kirkpatrick, we've seen, has the ability to do that. And I think if the Bengals want that big playability on defense, which I don't see why they wouldn't, he's a guy that I think should be a very high priority to resign. Connor, you mentioned his often success against Antonio Brown. Antonio Brown's had a couple of good games against the Bengals as well, but last handful of games, I think
Dre doesn't get burned ever. Like I watched the tape. I mean, the Bengals play so much too high safety coverage, and him and Adam Jones, like them or not, both of them have been very, very good at not giving up the deep ball. Jones struggled early in the year. I remember the Broncos, Emmanuel Sanders torched him one play. But for the most part, they've both been really good with limited safety help, which is a lot to ask for of a corner, which when you're comparing Dre to a Stephon Gilmore or AJ, super familiar with the Bills or the Texans' defensive schemes, but I would guess the Bengals are one of the teams that most frequently uses 2 high safety coverages, which really doesn't help the corner out, so they're asked to do a lot more than other corners. So that's another plus for Dre. They're
left on an island a lot, and that's just the way the scheme has been. It was like that under Mike Zimmer as well. But I think some of the issues with deep balls that might have happened earlier in the year was also because there was a new starting safety back there in Sean Williams. Definitely. You could tell there was miscommunication. That being said, I think Drake Kirkpatrick is a high priority to re-sign because of his potential big playability, his length, and his ability to get into the chest of a receiver off the line. The other thing I'm really excited about is the return of William Jackson III, and this will segue into our next topic, but depending on what shakes up with the roster this year, what moves are made, what moves aren't, I think the sky is the limit for this kid. I think he's super athletic. It's a really big bummer that he had to redshirt with an injury this last year, but he probably, just based on who they had veteran-wise, wouldn't have played very much. Even so, I think his role this year is going to probably be a bit more high profile. Maybe even if you get, if you move on from one particular player we're going to be talking about and you re-sign Kirkpatrick, who knows? You could have Jackson and Kirkpatrick as your starting corners next year. We don't know, but lot to be happy about with the secondary. I think as we said, it was encouraging that there was more. There was improvement as the year went on, and you saw the points drastically drop as the year went on against opposition. Scott, did you have an additional thought?
Actually, one thing I was just going to ask, just something you kind of hit on. Assume if we lose Kirkpatrick and or Jones or neither, if we were to pick right now, who do you guys think the Bengals starting cornerbacks are for 2017?
Denard and Shaw, and Kivari Russell, some combination of those three. Or maybe a first round draft pick again. I don't think it's going to happen, but I would say that Denard would definitely be on the outside. I would say Kivari Russell would probably be on the outside and Shaw in the slot.
Yeah, I think they give, in that case, I think they give Jackson a shot at starting. And it's probably some combination also that Connor mentioned with Russell and Denard.
I forgot about Jackson. Jackson might be starting too. Dang.
Yeah, I would.
Even more difficult.
Yeah, I would say they'd have to give a shot to Jackson to start, and I would not be surprised if he does get some chance to play heavy snaps this year if his knee it was his shoulder, I believe. I
think you hope so regardless. I mean, he's a playmaker.
Yeah, and you saw it in college, and his workouts were unbelievable, if you remember. Great showing at the combine and things like that.